would they be permitted to participate in, embody, and practice what I would call Black culture generally in our church? The answer is absolutely not. Why? Because the characteristics that mark Black culture as a generalization, in the same way Paul's talking about Cretans on Crete, they are evil, murderous, violent, bestial people. They steal, they kill, they destroy, they look like Satan in how they act.
That's Brian Sauvé, pastor of Refuge Church in Ogden, Utah. What you just heard was an excerpt from the King's Hall podcast, and it isn't parody. When I first heard that clip, I couldn't believe how casually it linked culture and sin. But the more I looked into it, the clearer it became. This isn't one man's rant. It's part of something much larger. In this piece, we're going to unpack what drives rhetoric like that, how faith turns into control, and what it costs when power wears a cross. When people hear the words Christian and nation together, it sometimes sounds harmless, almost inspiring, like faith and patriotism walking hand in hand. But what if I told you that phrase, Christian nationalism, has almost nothing to do with following Jesus and everything to do with power? Because what we're seeing right now isn't revival, it's rebranding. It's control dressed up like conviction. Yet real faith, the kind that shaped movements for abolition and civil rights, has never been about control. It's always been about compassion. That tension, coercion versus compassion, is the heartbeat of this story. One of the clearest examples of what happens when coercion wins comes from a pastor in Utah named Brian Sauvé. He said Black people could join his church, but only if they left Black culture at the door. Then he used Old Testament law to justify executing rebellious young Black men. If that shocks you, remember, bad theology rarely sells itself as evil. It markets itself as safety. That's the propaganda trick. Fear packages faith, nostalgia sold as holiness. So today, we're unpacking what Christian nationalism really is, how it's woven into American politics, and how its gospel of coercion stands in total opposition to Jesus' gospel of compassion. Because if we're going to protect what's sacred, we have to know the difference between a kingdom built on love and an empire built on fear. So who is Brian Sauvé, and how did a pastor from Utah end up in national headlines for saying something like this? Sauvé is the lead pastor of Refuge Church in Ogden, Utah. He's also a writer, podcaster, and one of the voices behind the King's Hall, a show built around the idea of rebuilding Christendom. Now that phrase sounds innocent, even noble, until you unpack what it really means. It's not about reviving faith, it's about reviving control. When Sauvé says, rebuild Christendom, he's talking about restoring a social order where the church dominates every sphere of government, education, culture, and family. That vision traces straight back to dominion theology. We believe that Christians are commanded to rule the earth in God's name. It's a theology of coercion masquerading as obedience. But here's what often gets lost. Faith has always contained a counter movement. While one stream of Christianity reached for crowns and thrones, another washed feet. While some built empires, others built hospitals and abolition societies. Real discipleship has always been a contest between coercion and compassion, between those who use power to control and those who use love to serve. Sauvé preaches the first stream loudly. He calls for biblical patriarchy, warns that feminism and progressivism are destroying the church, and insists that righteous men must reclaim authority. It's not new. It's just old hierarchy in fresh packaging. The language of law and order hides a theology of dominance. And yet, to his audience, it sounds protective. That's how the propaganda works. He wraps fear in the language of family, paints control as safety, and brands exclusion as courage. It's slick marketing using nostalgia to sanctify power. People who feel anxious about cultural change hear words like rebuild, restore, and defend, and it feels like home. But real faith doesn't fear the table growing larger. It thrives when everyone brings their story, their rhythm, their tongue. The early church wasn't a fortress, it was a feast where Jews, Greeks, men, women, rich, poor, all shared bread. That's the model Sauvé's gospel of control can't replicate. So keep that tension in mind as we move forward. We're not just analyzing one man's bad sermon. We're looking at a worldview that trades compassion for coercion and then markets the trade as virtue. Next, we'll dig into exactly what he said and how his use of scripture reveals the deeper machinery behind Christian nationalism. Let's talk about what Brian Sauvé actually said, because hearing it in context makes it even clearer what's at work here. On his podcast, The King's Hall, Sauvé and his co-host started with what sounded like a discussion about crime. They brought up statistics on young black men, pretending to analyze data, and then Sauvé dropped this. If you had 100 black men in a room, 5 of them would have committed murder. He said that, provided that black culture itself was violent, bestial, and satanic. Then came the kicker. He said that black people could join his church, but they couldn't bring black culture with them. That's assimilation with a halo on top. It's saying you can belong here as long as you stop being you. And that's where we see the clash between coercion and compassion. Coercion says, obey and you can stay. Compassion says, you're already welcome, now let's grow together. But instead of the gospel of compassion, Sauvé leaned on the gospel of control. He cited Deuteronomy 21, a passage about stoning a rebellious son, as evidence that God endorses execution for disobedient behavior. It's an ancient penal code from a theocracy, and he tried to drag it into a modern democracy. But Jesus encountered that same law in action when people dragged a woman before him, demanding death by stoning. And his answer wasn't more punishment, it was mercy. Let the one without sin cast the first stone. That's not just a difference in interpretation, it's a different kingdom entirely. Then there's that 5% claim. The math doesn't work. If 5% of black men were murderers, we'd have over 1 million murderers walking around. There aren't even that many homicides nationwide, but propaganda isn't about accuracy, it's about authority. The tone of confidence becomes the proof. Lies spoken with certainty feel safer than truth spoken with humility. And that's how movements like this spread. They don't educate, they reinforce fear. They flood the heart with anxiety, then call that anxiety discernment. But here's the hope hidden in history. Every era that birthed this kind of theology also birthed people who resisted it, believers who remembered compassion over coercion. And that fight is still going on. In the next section, we'll dig deeper into the movement behind Sauvé's ideas, Christian nationalism, and how it thrives whenever faith and fear start speaking the same language. So let's slow down and talk about what Christian nationalism actually is. Because on paper, it sounds simple. Love God, love your country. But that's not what's happening here. Christian nationalism isn't faith joined with patriotism. It's faith repackaged as a political identity, a way to decide who counts as a real American and who doesn't. At its core, Christian nationalism says that the United States was founded as a Christian nation and should be ruled by biblical law. Not the teachings of Jesus, the compassion part, but law. And that difference changes everything because Jesus built communities. Christian nationalists build hierarchies. One liberates, the other legislates. That's the same theological fork we've been tracing. Coercion versus compassion. The compassionate gospel heals. The coercive one controls. Now, Brian Sauvé fits perfectly into that mold. His claim that black culture doesn't belong in church isn't racism, it's doctrine. It's the belief that holiness equals uniformity. In that worldview, difference equals danger. So purity must be enforced. That's why this movement obsesses over who gets to speak, love, teach, lead, or even exist freely. But propaganda is what turns that doctrine into power. Christian nationalism markets fear as moral clarity. It tells people that their faith is under attack, their children are being corrupted, their country is slipping away. Then it offers one solution: control. Control the schools, control the laws, control the story. And it works because it feels righteous. People think that they're defending God when they're really defending nostalgia. They remember that time that they felt safer, simpler, even if that safety only applied to a few. The myth of the Christian nation isn't about history, it's about comfort. Yet history itself keeps reliving another story. The same faith that was used to justify conquest also fueled abolitionists, civil rights preachers, and liberation theologians. Every time coercion built an empire, compassion built a movement to tear it down. And that resistance is part of the Christian story too, and it's worth reclaiming. So when we talk about Christian nationalism, don't picture Sunday worship with a flag in the corner. Picture a marketing campaign that baptizes hierarchy. It's about selling certainty to people scared of change. In the next section, we'll trace how that sales pitch got woven into American politics. how pastors, presidents, and pundits turned faith into a tool for maintaining power, and why that merger still shapes the country today. So how did this fusion of religion and control work its way into American politics? It's been slowly built, brick by brick over centuries. It started in the colonial era, when European settlers arrived claiming the land for God. That's where the myth began, that conquest was holy and that domination could be devotion. They called it manifest destiny. It was propaganda before we had that word, using scripture to baptize empire. And while that ideology spread, so did its opposite. Quakers, abolitionists, and native converts resisted it, insisting faith was meant to serve, not conquer. The battle between coercion and compassion was already underway. By the 1800s, that struggle moved into the pulpits of the South. Preachers used the Bible to defend slavery, calling it God's order. But again, others rose up. The Black church, born from bondage, preaching liberation instead of submission. That's compassion pushing back against coercion. Fast forward to the 1950s. America was fighting communism abroad and anxiety at home. Politicians saw an opportunity. They rebranded the nation as One Nation Under God, and In God We Trust appeared on money. Public prayer became a symbol of patriotism, but the goal wasn't worship, it was marketing. Religion was the packaging for nationalism. Propaganda learned how to quote scripture. Then came the 1980s and the rise of the moral majority, where televangelists and politicians discovered fear voting power. They preached that America was under moral attack from feminism, civil rights, and gay rights, and that the only solution was to restore biblical order. Again, coercion dressed as righteousness, and the compassionate voices, the ones quoting Jesus about justice and mercy, well, they were called weak, worldly, or worse. Every generation since has reclaimed that same drama. Fear of cultural change becomes a moral panic, and someone steps up to sell control as the cure. That's how Christian nationalism migrated from pulpits to ballots. It's not about saving souls, it's about managing citizens. But even here, hope still breathes. Every era that baptized control also birthed movements of compassion. The civil rights preachers, the sanctuary churches for immigrants, the pastors who chose people over party, they remind us that faith can challenge power instead of blessing it. In the next section, we'll dig into why this system is so dangerous today, how it thrives on disinformation, moral panic, and the false promise that domination can ever be divine. Let's talk about why Christian nationalism is so dangerous. First, because it rewrites history. It tells a story where America was chosen by God, set apart as a beacon of divine order. But the founders weren't building a theocracy, they were running from one. They understood what happens when government and religion share a bed. You get control, corruption, and crusades. Yet, Christian nationalism keeps recycling that myth because it's powerful propaganda. It gives people the illusion of innocence. We're not trying to dominate, we're just returning to God. Second, it weaponizes scripture. Instead of using the Bible to liberate, it uses it to legislate. It cherry picks the harshest laws and then calls them holy while ignoring the compassion that's supposed to define faith. That same theology Sauvé used when he twisted Deuteronomy into a modern justification for violence. He chose coercion over compassion. And once you do that, you can justify almost anything. Third, it dehumanizes dissent. Anyone who questions the system becomes rebellious. If you're Black, queer, feminist, progressive, anything outside their blueprint, you're branded as a threat to God's order. That's how authoritarian systems grow, by turning neighbors into enemies. And it's not new. The same fear language was used to justify slavery, segregation, and silence. Fear gives control permission to act like conviction. Fourth, it normalizes violence. When a pastor can stand behind a pulpit or in front of a microphone and imply that some people deserve execution because of culture, it's conditioning. Every empire that merged faith with politics taught people to see domination as devotion. That's the moral inversion at the heart of this movement. And finally, it creates a false moral hierarchy where God always seems to look like those in charge: straight, white, conservative, male. That becomes the default image of righteousness. Everyone else must assimilate or be disciplined. But here's the truth that keeps hope alive. Coercion always breeds resistance. The same gospel that's been twisted for power still carries the power to set people free. Compassion isn't weakness, it's subversion. It refuses to play by the empire's rules. That's why this matters. Christian nationalism isn't just bad theology. It's a moral crisis with political consequences. And the antidote isn't silence. It's a faith bold enough to live when fear demands control. Next, we'll talk about what that faith actually looks like, how humility, service, and empathy can rebuild what coercion tried to destroy. If Christian nationalism shows us what happens when faith gets hijacked by control, then what does real faith actually look like? It looks like humility over hierarchy. It looks like compassion over coercion. Real faith doesn't need power to prove itself. It moves through service and not status. Jesus never built an empire. He didn't run for governor of Rome. He built a table. He fed the hungry, healed the broken, and challenged the powerful. And that's the model Christian nationalism can't imitate because it relies on fear and not love. When Brian Sauvé said that Black culture doesn't belong in the church, he wasn't protecting holiness, he was rejecting humanity. He was rejecting rhythm, story, and expression that were born out of pain and turned into praise. That's the sound of survival, and real faith hears it as sacred, not sinful. Every major movement for justice in this country, abolition, civil rights, liberation theology, was led by people whose faith refused to serve fear. They practiced a gospel that fed the poor and faced down empires. That same spirit is alive today, even in small ways. The church is opening their doors to the unhoused. The pastors preaching equity when it's unpopular. The communities choosing reconciliation over retaliation. That's the gospel of compassion at work. And here's what's remarkable. Compassion just doesn't heal, it disrupts. It undermines systems that depend on domination. When you lead with love instead of control, you break the propaganda cycle. Fear stops selling. Shame stops sticking. The whole machine starts to lose its power. Real faith doesn't ask people to erase who they are. It calls them to bring their full selves to the table. Every tongue, every rhythm, every background becomes a reflection of the divine. That's what kingdom come actually means, a world big enough for everyone. So when churches preach exclusion, when they confuse holiness with homogeneity, it's not just bad theology, it's a failure of imagination. They've forgotten that love doesn't shrink to stay pure, it expands to stay true. And that's where hope re-enters the story. Because no matter how loud coercion gets, compassion keeps finding its way back into the room. Always has, always will. In our final section, we'll close where this leaves us, how we rebuild faith, community, and conscience after the illusion of Christian America fades. Christian nationalism sells an illusion, a story that sounds holy but smells like fear. It tells people that if we just get the right kind of Christian in charge, the world will finally be righteous. But history keeps proving the opposite. Every time religion grabs for power, it ends up looking less like heaven and more like empire. Brian Sauvé's words weren't a fluke, they were a system. You see, he's the logical outcome of a system that confuses control with calling. When faith becomes about dominance, compassion starts to look like weakness. And that's how we end up with pulpits preaching hierarchy instead of humility. But the good news, the real gospel, is that faith can recover. The illusion can crumble, but the spirit that built communities, comforted the broken, and fought for injustice, it can't be destroyed. It just waits for people brave enough to pick it back up. And we're seeing that everywhere right now. And churches rethinking what worship looks like, and believers questioning what they were taught about power and purpose, and people of faith and people who've walked away, meeting in the same spaces and saying, we can do better than this. That's rebuilding in real time. Rebuilding starts with honesty. It means naming manipulations when we see it, especially when it wears a cross. It means understanding how propaganda works so we don't mistake fear for faith. It means returning to the core that never changes. Love your neighbor, seek justice, walk humbly. If we can hold to that, then the empire loses its grip because power can't survive where compassion lives. So when someone tells you America needs to be made Christian again, ask what they really mean. If they mean more love, more mercy, more welcome, then maybe. But if they mean control, silence, and conformity, it's not Christianity. That's just another empire pretending to be holy. Faith doesn't need nationalism to stay alive. It just needs people willing to live what they believe without using it to rule others. So whether you're inside the church or far beyond it, this is the invitation. Don't let fear speak louder than love. Rebuild something worth believing in. One honest conversation, one act of courage, one small community at a time. That's how we begin again.